Hey everyone, Sumo Spiffy here. Welcome to a video about uncalled false starts in professional sumo. This is 100% a niche topic within what is, outside Japan, itself a niche topic. For that reason, I presume the majority of you know at least the basics of what I'm about to discuss. That said, if you don't know what I'm talking about, welcome! Whether you're a sumo fan who isn't quite sure what I'm referring to, or you've barely seen sumo content at all, we're happy to have you. For anyone in that second group, and really to make sure the rest of us are on the same page, here's a brief setup for what we're going to talk about. At the start of a sumo match, the tachiai, the wrestlers are supposed to charge each other at basically the same moment as you see here. The way they sync up most of the time is this. One wrestler sets up by putting his fists down. The other then touches the ground himself. Both wrestlers having their hands down at the same time is the important part. That's the trigger for the fight to start. A mata, the sumo term for a false start, happens when the wrestlers are out of sync. Most of the time, one wrestler comes off the line and the other barely moves. Even if both wrestlers come off the line like they're ready to go, if there's too big a gap between when they move, if they are in essence not starting the fight at the same time, that's also grounds for a false start. The gyoji, the ref, stops them, they reset, and they try again. Sometimes the first wrestler charges before the second gets his hands to the ground, but the match is allowed to continue. Technically, any instance of this can be categorized as an uncalled false start. But we want to give some grace to the officials. They're human and sometimes the gap is so small, it's essentially impossible for human eyes to see it at full speed. As such, we're focused on instances like this where they're not even close to touching the ground at the same time. That is, when the match goes on despite them being clearly out of sync. At this point, you might very reasonably wonder where the title of the video came from. Break the sport? That seems like a hell of an overstatement, especially since I, myself, refer to it as a niche topic within sumo. And I admit, the way the title naturally reads, that this is about something which will break the whole sport, is likely an overstatement. I'm not claiming this is going to tear sumo down to its foundations or diminish it to where it can no longer function as a professional entity. I used this title because it's attention-grabbing, I hope, and I didn't like any of the others I came up with. But I don't lie in my titles. I'm not saying this will break the whole sport, but I am absolutely going to argue this is breaking part of the sport. Whether or not you agree, in the end, you'll at least see why I feel the way I feel. Very quick note before we continue. We are at 9,600 subscribers. Our race against the Sunday morning sumo show to 10K continues. If just 5% of our unsubscribed viewers click the button on each video between now and the May Basho, we will get there. Thanks to all our current subscribers, and thanks in advance to everyone who helps get us over the line. Okay, false starts. And I need to be upfront about something. I have rewritten this script, in part or in full, so many f***ing times. It might be the most difficult subject I've tackled for two conflicting reasons. One, I know there's a problem, but two, none of my arguments sufficiently explained the scope of the problem. I kept leaning on three main points. One is about really absurd false starts where one or both wrestlers don't even fight because it's so obvious, but the officials still tell them to keep going. But that has a degree of separation from the other points, and it keeps not fitting quite right in the script. So I might turn that into a short. The second was focused on fairness in competition. Specifically, a competition can't be fair if one side has no reasonable way to combat the tactics of the other. Here was my logic. This is a match between Kotoeho and Fuji Ryoga. Kotoeho's fists are grounded, Fuji leans forward to touchdown, not quickly but not slowly. Kotoeho launches himself forward before Fuji reaches the ground. Strictly speaking, this should be a false start. However, the rule that wrestlers need to be in sync is sometimes read another way, that the wrestlers need to show mutual consent to start the fight. In this case, Kotoeho doesn't budge until Fuji Ryoga is partway to the ground. He only acts when Fuji is far enough down that he must be committing to the fight. This also puts them not in perfect sync, but at least somewhat close to it. Whether or not this should be a false start, I'll leave to you to decide. What's definitely true is that the JSA wants to keep the action moving. In this case, Kotoeho has time to get his hands up, but not really attack before Fuji Ryoga charges. If they're going to be flexible on when the guy who sets up first can launch, letting this one go does make some sense. Then there's this fight, seen by probably everyone who watched the March Basho, Fuji no Kawa and Hoshoryu. Fuji's ready. Hoshoryu stares him down. Then, despite Hoshoryu moving quickly, Fuji gets a pretty big jump on him, definitely bigger than Kotoeho's. What matters here though isn't just the size of Fuji's head start, but how he got it, by taking off the instant Hoshoryu moves. The difference between this and Kotoeho's Tachiai is that Fujinokawa makes no effort to be in sync with Hoshoryu. As long as he waits for some type of movement, they might let him charge at any point after that. And if they call the false start, so what? Wrestlers only get yelled at if they do it more than once. He gets a freebie. Of course, they don't call the false start. Hoshoryu can't find a good position on the Tachiai, never quite finds his footing, and Fujinokawa eventually sets him up for the pulldown. The fact Hoshoryu lost, and that said loss wound up mattering quite a bit in the Yusho race, makes it easier to remember this fight. But focusing on the loss is results-oriented thinking. After all, flip it around. Say Fuji keeps doing this and it improves his odds of beating Hoshoryu from like 15% to 30%. Hoshoryu still wins most of those matches in the long run. If we looked at their head-to-head record and saw Hoshoryu up 7-3, it wouldn't seem like there's a problem. But does that suddenly make it okay to let the underdog break the rules to become less of an underdog? Obviously not. But this argument never felt strong enough for two reasons. One, if the JSA is inevitably going to allow some flexibility on Tachiai timing, they're creating a gray area where all we can do is debate where to draw the line between fair and unfair. Two, when I say one side can't reasonably combat the other's tactics, I mean using their normal sumo style. Fujinokawa had a pretty good head start despite Hoshoryu getting his hands down quite fast. Hoshoryu would have to make a pretty significant change to his Tachiai to stop Fuji, or anyone, from doing this. But whether that's reasonable is another gray area. In short, if we stand in different parts of those gray areas, this argument is a lot less likely to hold weight with you than with someone who already sees things the same as me, and making an argument that's mostly preaching to the choir isn't why I do this. That's where point number 3 was supposed to come in. When these obvious false starts aren't called, it's not just a question of timing of 1 or 2/10 of a second. They actually work against a Rikishi's sumo training. The core of this argument is that Rikishi spend years in amateur sumo learning to start the match at the same time as their opponent. When they get to the pros, they have to adjust to the more flexible timing structure, but that's okay. Not every Tachiai in practice will happen with perfect timing either. To try and quantify this, say we have a scale of aggressiveness from 1 to 10. Amateur sumo stops at 5. 6 through 10 are some degree of jumping the gun on your opponent. Guys will see 6s in practice, maybe 7s. They should be prepared for those situations on match day. But then there's these fights. Fujinokawa against Hoshoryu is a 9. Fujinokawa launches against Wakamoto Haru before either of Waka's hands get down. That's a 9. Tobizaru against Oshiumi is a 9, 9.5. Yoshino Fuji against Hoshoryu is a 9.5. You gotta watch Kinbozan's hand carefully here since it's barely visible, but Asasuiryu takes off immediately when it moves. That's a 10. Yoshi against Wakamoto Haru is a 10. Toki Hayate against Ura is a 10. Yoshi versus Kirishima is a 10. Hell, maybe this one's an 11. I know some percentage of you are thinking wrestlers should be able to come up with a tactic to defend against this, but that seriously undersells their situation because saying change tactics assumes they have a tactic available that fits the problem. They probably don't because they've never had to come up with one. They've been doing sumo most of their lives, and for the vast majority of that time, this wasn't an issue. To me, that's a compelling reason to crack down on these false starts. When you force these wrestlers to deal with something outside the bounds of their training, of their muscle memory, it's not just unfair, it creates sloppier fights. When one wrestler can only absorb or try to work around the initial hit, whether or not he turns it around, it's not as compelling as a good solid Tachiai where both wrestlers have a chance to look for the attack they want. Unfortunately, this argument is also weaker than I originally thought for a similar reason as the last one. If a Rikishi or a whole stable doesn't like it, they can, in theory, start practicing ways to fight back. I'd argue that's still a problem though, because it forces them into a lesser of two evils situation. Do you spend enough time on this to create a solid defense, even though it's only a handful of wrestlers who you need to be concerned with, and take away from the training that helps against everyone else? Or do you stay focused on the great majority and just try to figure things out if and when you do get hit by a big head start? This isn't a choice someone should have to make when it revolves around opponents who significantly stray from not just the rules as written, but how the sport is even taught. But it is still an option. And if you don't think these head starts are a problem, you're more likely to find it reasonable that wrestlers and stables have to decide whether to take that option. Again, This feels too much like preaching to the choir. So here I was, writing and reading and rereading and rewriting, and I couldn't escape the gray areas that kept undercutting these ideas. Then I started thinking about Takakeisho. A brief introduction for those who need it. Takakeisho was a gifted but injury-plagued wrestler who spent basically 5 years running at Ozeki. He came quite close to Yokozuna promotion a couple times, but never earned the white robe. He was also the first wrestler I saw fans complain about that he should be getting called for false starts. Unlike the subjects of this video, Takakeisho triggered his fights. The issue people had was that when he did so, he didn't always get his hands to the ground.
Nope.
Obviously, the sooner he pulled his hand up, the sooner he could focus his energy forward, so this Tachiai consistently bought him a split second of extra time. It wasn't much, but his sumo was based around his charge, and that split second could be meaningful. If nothing else, it helped prevent his opponents from getting a split second ahead of him. The nature of his false starts wasn't what I thought of though, it was the tenor of the conversation around them. Obviously, I don't claim to have seen everything anyone said about Takakeisho not touching the ground on the Tachiai, but when I saw people gripe about it, it was a rules thing. That's not what he's supposed to do, he's breaking the rules, etc. From the present looking back, I'd even call it more of a purity thing. Not just that's against the rules, but also that's not how sumo works. Some fans were, or at least seemed, genuinely upset that nothing was done. But there wasn't much, at least where I was looking, that spoke to what actual advantage this offered. In the present, when we talk about these early launches, the conversation focuses more on what's gained from these head starts, or at least treats them as offering a definite unintended advantage. Now, most of that for me comes from this community, which was tiny back then. And this community tends to have more of a sports fan perspective, so I'm not surprised the nature of the conversation is different in this way. All the same, I couldn't shake the observation that Takakeisho's Tachiai was less obviously problematic, yet seemed to bother those who noticed it more. Like I said, some of them got upset. I've been banging the drum on these early launches for a while, but I've never been more than frustrated, and it's rare that I see anyone who sounds more noticeably pissed off than that. So I kept looking things over, wondering if I'd missed something with Takakeisho or blown these early launches out of proportion. I really hoped it wasn't the second because I'd already spent enough time on this video, but I had to do my due diligence. What I discovered is what created the title of this video. These early launches are breaking the Tachiai. Yeah, I know that probably still sounds like an overstatement. Walk this path with me, it's not long. Here's the same normal Tachiai from the start of the video. Kirishima sets up, Takayasu settles in. Takayasu touches the ground, both wrestlers charge, and the fight is on. Here's a Takakeisho Tachiai. Tobizaru sets up, Takakeisho settles in. Takakeisho reaches for the ground. Tobi's supposed to react to him touching the ground. Instead, Takakeisho takes off before he gets there. Tobi now has to react to that, which in this case he does. They start in effectively almost perfect sync. But the point of this comparison is not what Takakeisho does or how these Tachiais are different, it's to show how they're the same. Let's watch them side by side. Wrestler A sets up and waits for Wrestler B to start the match. Wrestler B settles in, knowing Wrestler A is ready to hit him as soon as he touches down. Wrestler B starts the match. In general form, these are exactly the same. Each wrestler has an equal if opposite role to play in setting off the fight. Takakeisho alters the expected movement on his end, but the core of what the Tachiai is supposed to be is still there. Now let's go back to Fujinokawa and Hoshoryu. Fuji sets up. He's wrestler A, the one who's ready to go when wrestler B, Hoshoryu, triggers the match. The trigger is supposed to be Hoshoryu touching the ground. Instead, Fuji takes off as soon as Hoshoryu moves. Up to this point, I've been calling this an obvious or blatant false start. I essentially treated this as a more severe version of Kotoeho versus Fujiryoga. It took these weeks of writing and studying to realize what's actually going on. Fujinokawa is stealing Hoshoryu's role as the one who starts the fight.
Huh?
Stick with me. Think of starting the fight as the action role and setting up first as the reaction role. Action and reaction all in balance. When Fuji sets up, he takes the reaction role. Hoshoryu prepares for his action role. But when Fuji starts this far out in front, he's forcing Hoshoryu to react to him and thus has taken the action role for himself. Now someone's probably asking, but doesn't that make Hoshoryu the reaction role now? It does not. Here's why. Each role allows for certain tactics. The action wrestler can start fast, play with timing, bait false starts, etc. The reaction can decide how precisely to time the start, if he wants to hang back and henka, and so on. The available tactics also depend on what each individual wrestler has practiced in each role. But for the tachi to function as intended, each wrestler has to know which role they're in because that informs them as to which tactics are available. Hoshoryu is only the reaction here in the sense that he has to react to Fuji suddenly being in his face in order to not get knocked on his ass. Realistically, on this tachi, he has no role. And that's a problem when, presumably, every tachi he's ever practiced has him on one side or the other. We can see this in other matches. Asasuiryu takes off the moment Kinbozan's hand moves and is on top of him almost before he can do anything. Kinbozan deals with it because he's twice Asasuiryu's size, but Asasuiryu really started the fight. Kinbozan had to react to it. Toki Hayate takes off as soon as Ura's hand moves. If you've seen enough of Ura's fights, this tachi may not look unusual because he frequently hangs back and absorbs the initial contact, but he often also likes to get his hands out in front of him. We have no idea whether or not he wanted to do that here because he never had the chance. All he could do was react and take Toki's charge. Yoshino Fuji waited a split second after Hoshoryu moved, but still charged well before Hoshoryu's hands hit the ground. He hits Hoshoryu's shoulder before Hoshoryu can do anything of his own accord, and Hoshoryu winds up kinda matrixing around him. He's forced to react to Yoshi's charge because Yoshi effectively started the fight. And these were all on day 3 of March. I trust at this point it's clear what I'm talking about. But if you're still not sure why I'm treating this situation as a big deal, let's compare it to other popular sports. What would baseball look like if a pitch at the hitter's eye level was called a strike because it was at least over home plate? What if American football allowed offensive linemen to hold as much as they want as long as they don't throw the defender to the ground? What if soccer, aka everyone else's football, allowed offsides because whatever, the runner wasn't that far past the defense? In each case, these examples only impact one aspect of the competition. There's plenty more that would be unaffected. But if you know these sports, you know such changes would still swing the balance towards the side getting away with the rule breaks. None would guarantee victory, but all would make victory more likely. And now that we've covered why this is a problem, we can finish up with the detail that makes it all so much worse. The Japan Sumo Association seems completely fine with it. I've shown what I considered the 8 most egregious false starts of the March Basho. Others were a little less bad, but still pretty obvious. Eventually though, I realized the exact number wasn't as important as something else I didn't initially consider. How often do they actually call the false starts? So I went back through March and checked. Not all the false starts mattered. What I needed were matches like this. One wrestler launches early, the other still moves to start the fight, but the Gyoji calls the Mata anyway because he sees it's not a fair start. You may notice this is the same example I used at the start of the video. That's because this is the only time it happened. One false start call. One. This made a couple things glaringly obvious. First, the idea of being in sync seems dead and buried. The JSA is instead leaning hard on mutual consent. And 2, their definition of mutual consent has become absurdly expansive. There was only one other false start against someone when the opponent was ready to go. Asakoryu got called for not coming close to touching down when starting his fight against Roga. But that wasn't even close. If you don't call that, you aren't calling anything. Every other time, someone jumped the gun and the opponent made a move to fight, even if they were taken by surprise and acted out of reflex, the fight was allowed to continue. It should go without saying how easily this reading of the rules can be abused. Truth be told though, my concern is not about the practice growing to where we see it 50 times a basho. The vast majority of Rikishi may not practice defending against this tactic, but they don't practice doing it either. There's a good chance many or most would do worse if they tried adopting Fujinokawa or Yoshino Fuji's style. But it shouldn't take this happening more, hitting a certain level of adoption, for the JSA to crack down. It's already a problem unto itself. Sumo is a sport that doesn't rely on a lot of rules. The tachi is the most structured part. And even on the tachi, there's a lot of playing what the wrestlers are allowed to do. But one of the few constants is the balance between the action and the reaction. Allowing significantly early launches to start fights shatters that balance. If you look at the 8 fights I highlighted, it might seem like all that's needed is to hammer Fujinokawa and Yoshinofuji for this because they're responsible for over half the examples. Maybe add Toki Hayate to the list since he had another one and is gaining a reputation for this as well. Problem is, for this exact reason, I also tracked these in the May 2025 tournament before Yoshi or Fujinokawa were in the top division and found 9 from 8 different wrestlers. It might only be a handful who do this as a matter of practice, but their matches aren't the only times it happens. And again, I'm only talking about the most breathtakingly obvious examples. They are by no means the only matches where you can see this imbalance occur. If you're the JSA, I don't care how much you want the action to go and not get hung up on false starts. This strikes at the structure of your sport. If you can't find a way to do something about at least the most obvious examples, I don't know how you expect to fix any other problems you come across. And that is my treatise on uncalled false starts in professional sumo. I'd say this is the most niche topic I'm likely to make a video about, but I think we all know I'll attach myself to anything like a lamprey if it hits my brain the right way. In any case, I better rest up for the Banzuke on Sunday. Have a great day, and I'll see you soon.